Good evening, everyone. Good to be here with you all. Nice to have so many visitors. Hi, friends. I'm glad you all are here. We'll be resuming our Sunday evening Old Testament survey tonight after the hiatus of VBS week. Upcoming this week in the reading plan that we're going through, that we're preaching through on Sunday evenings, we will cover 2 Chronicles chapter 6, which is where we will be tonight. So I'd encourage you to open up your Bibles to 2 Chronicles chapter 6. This is an incredibly important scene in the Old Testament where Solomon, the anointed Prince of Peace, the current king of Israel, prays before the entire nation as the temple is dedicated. The text presents for us several important ideas for us to consider as we assemble together on Sundays and Wednesdays. As I was reading through this text, preparing for the lesson, I was thinking about the upcoming class that Tim Garrison will be leading on Wednesday nights. That, from my understanding, is titled Developing Our Talents for Worship, which I am really looking forward to participating in. And this text here is some beautiful Old Testament source material for some of the attitudes and fundamental principles we might try to adopt when we meet together, when we assemble together on Sundays and Wednesdays, and any other time we meet together in order to praise God together. We're going to cover the entirety of chapter 6. We're not going to read every single verse, so I'd encourage you to have a Bible open as we kind of jump around a little bit. We'll do it sequentially, but it's good to have a Bible in front of you. And we're going to cover the first 3 verses of chapter 7 as well. What I've done is I've broken it down into 3 sections, as you can see there, that focus on the posture of both the people and Solomon, the prayer of Solomon as he dedicates the temple, and the power in God's response to Solomon's prayer. The posture, the prayer, and the power is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So let's begin in chapter 6, starting in verse 1. The scene here begins after the glory of God fills the temple in chapter 5. And Solomon sees God's glory filling the temple that he's gone through all this effort in building. Chronicles puts a lot of emphasis on the temple of the Lord. And Solomon sees the glory of the Lord filling the temple when he looks at what's happening. And he says in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, he says this, Yahweh has said that he would dwell in the thick cloud. I have built you a lofty house and a place for your dwelling forever. This is a transition from the completion of the temple to the prayer that we're going to be working our way through and focusing on tonight. Solomon here, in these introductory verses, is acknowledging the nature of God. You're going to notice that repeated throughout this prayer here. But he begins in verses 1 and 2 by acknowledging the nature of God. God is unseen, God is unlimited, and God is eternal. And so Solomon here says, though you are unseen, though you are unlimited, and though you are eternal, Yahweh, we will build you this visible temple. We ask that you will dwell here, and we dedicate this place as yours. And then in verse 3 details the posture. We kind of get a play-by-play here, starting in verse 3. It says in verse 3, Then the king faced about and blessed all the assembly of Israel while the assembly of Israel was standing. We see 2 different posture details here. Number 1, the king, Solomon, turns to the people. He faces the people. Number 2, we see Israel is standing. Solomon begins with his focus on the temple. You can see him looking at the temple of God being filled, and he says what he says in verses 1 and 2, and then he turns around to the people. And it says that he blesses the people, and we're going to briefly survey that blessing that's found in verses 4 through 11. But he begins with his initial focus on God. And then once he has that foundation, his focus is on God. With that in place, then he turns to the people in order to help lead them in prayer, or we might say guide, guard, and direct them in prayer in our own vernacular. Now, with the people standing is much more participatory than sitting. That's why some people fall asleep during sermons, right? But we see here in this assembly that the people are engaged. They're participating. They are standing, they are observing, but they are not just observing, they are participating in what's going on. They were engaged, they were involved in what was taking place. I'll go ahead and make this point here since we're also adding some thoughts about our own public prayer in the assembly. But just so you know, if you read Solomon's prayer aloud, if you read it out loud, it's less than 5 minutes long. It wasn't super lengthy or excessively flowery compared to a lot of the prayers of the Psalms, but it is beautiful in its own regard. And so after turning to face the assembly, as we read in verse 3, Solomon begins by blessing the people. And I'm going to read through this whole section here, and I want you to know the way that he blesses the people. Because he blesses the people in a way that we might not think of as blessing the people. Do your best to pick it out while you're reading, and then I'll go back over it after we finish this. But look at verses 4 through 11 of 2 Chronicles chapter 6 with me. Solomon says, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who spoke with his mouth to my father David and has fulfilled it with his hands, saying, since the day that I brought my people from the land of Egypt, I did not choose a city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house that my name might be there. Nor did I choose any man for leader over my people. But I have chosen Jerusalem, that my name might be there. And I have chosen David to be over my people Israel." Now, it was in the heart of my father David, Solomon continues speaking here after quoting what God has said. Now, it was in the heart of my father David to build a house for the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. But Yahweh said to my father David, because it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son who will be born to you, he shall build the house for my name. Now Yahweh has fulfilled his word which he spoke. For I have risen in the place of my father David and sit on the throne of Israel as Yahweh promised, and have built the house for the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. There, in the temple, I have set the ark, which is the covenant of Yahweh, which he made with the sons of Israel. What you see about Solomon's blessing here, when Solomon blesses the people, Solomon's blessing the people is a declaration of faith. It's a declaration of God's faithfulness. It is an acknowledgement of what God has done so far and what he is doing by choosing to dwell in Jerusalem, in the temple. So as we sift through Solomon's prayer, I think there's some good principles to be learned here about our own assembly, as I've already said. Solomon offers some comments to help direct the minds of the people before the prayer itself. Did you notice that here? He doesn't just dive right into the prayer. He takes a moment to reflect, to prepare the people. Last week, as we were beginning our VBS, during the morning assembly after Bible class, Al, I'm gonna mention you here. Al Mitchell led our opening prayer, and I was very thankful that he did. What Al did before leading us in prayer is he offered a short reflection on the beauty of God's creation that he had seen in the 7 weeks of traveling leading up to VBS. He did it very humbly, and he did it to help focus our mind on what we were about to do. We were about to pray. We were about to approach the throne of God. And Solomon does the same thing in these verses here, offering some short blessings in order to help direct the mind of the people. Now, verses 12 and 13 offer what I see to be the most clear emphasis on posture in this section. Read with me verses 12 and 13 of 2 Chronicles chapter 6. It says, "Then he, Solomon stood before the altar of Yahweh in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands. Now Solomon had made a bronze platform, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high, and had set it in the midst of the court. And he stood on it, knelt on his knees in the presence of all of the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven. Solomon here raised his hands. He raised his hands, he spread out his hands, and he knelt before the entire assembly. I want you to see that this, what Solomon was doing, would have been very encouraging to the audience that was present. It would have been helpful for them seeing their king take this attitude of humility, vulnerability, and submission to God. Do you see that? That he's raising his hands towards heaven. He's spreading them as an act of, I'm ready to receive you, God. He is also kneeling, showing his submission in the process. We see Solomon showing us this attitude that is very important when we have our own prayers. It's important for us to take the same attitudes that we see present here of humility, reverence, vulnerability, awe, and submission to God. Now, as we move on to Solomon's prayer, I've got the outline up here on the screen. Solomon's prayer is pretty straightforward. We're going to read each section, just offer a few comments, and then we're going to continue on. This prayer can be sectioned off into these kind of 5 sections that you see on the screen here. It starts out in verses 14 through 17 with some words on praise for God's covenant faithfulness. And then in a transition verse in verse 18, it transitions to a recognition of God's transcendence, just how much greater God is than us. And then in verses 19 through 21, I would describe this as the central petition of the entire prayer. This is really the middle chunk that we see themes repeated throughout the rest of the prayer around it. This is what we would say is right in the middle. It's 42 verses long, and this one goes to verse 21. And then we move on from that to 7 specific petitions in verses 22 through 39. And then finally in verses 40 through 42, there's a conclusion and one final appeal. So let's work through this here, starting in verses 14 through 17. Solomon's prayer in verses 14 through 17 begins with praise. Read with me in verses 14 through 17. Solomon says, O Yahweh, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all their heart, who has kept with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him. Indeed, you have spoken with your mouth and have fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day. Now therefore, O Yahweh, the God of Israel, keep with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit on the throne of Israel, if only your sons take heed to their way to walk in my law, as you have walked before me. Now therefore, O Yahweh, the God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant David. What a beautiful opening to a prayer. Solomon begins from a place of recognition of who God is. He says that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is incomparable. He says specifically in the way God is incomparable is specifically in the way that he keeps his covenants and shows loving kindness to his people. This is really an opening of reflection and ultimately of praise. Now, praise is different from thanksgiving. And this is very important to note. Praise is typically an acknowledgement of who God is. Thanksgiving is more of a shift to what God has done and how it personally relates to us. One of the themes that I've helped out with a few different boys' Bible camps, participated in a few, been a camper at a few, been a counselor at a few. And One of the themes that I've seen throughout all of these boys' Bible camps is that they put a great emphasis on prayer time. At each of these camps, there's a time specifically blocked out in the day for prayer. And typically, there's one evening that is devoted to prayers of praise. But whenever I've been in any of those prayer times, and I've heard the prayers of the boys, one of the things that I've noticed, especially in more recent years, but one of the things I've noticed is that these boys always seem to change from praise, which is the intention of that time, to thanksgiving. Instead of, we praise you, God, for blank, they shift it to, we thank you, God, for blank. Now, it's a very subtle shift here, and I'm nitpicking a little bit, and I certainly don't think that there's anything wrong with it. Let me make that very clear. It is very good to be thankful, and I love that these boys have attitudes that are filled with gratitude and thankfulness. But I think that the flavor of prayer that is praise has been neglected. Praise is oriented to God's nature. Thanksgiving is oriented to God's benefits. Praise and thanksgiving, when taken to their unbalanced logical conclusions, meaning if you totally neglect one and only hold on to the other, actually presents some problems in the way that we think about God and pray to God. Think about this with me. When we focus overwhelmingly on thanksgiving while completely neglecting praise, we end up unintentionally making everything about ourselves, which seems backwards, right? You wouldn't think that praying prayers of thanksgiving to God for what He's done would be about yourself, but by only focusing on thanksgiving without praise, we end up making everything about ourselves. We begin to, without realizing it, habitually relate everything that God does to how it affects us. We put ourselves at the center when He should be at the center. On the other hand, when we neglect thanksgiving while focusing only on praise, we risk becoming detached from the focus that our relationship with God is. We lose the fact that what we have with God is not a contract, but a relationship. Praise without thanksgiving eventually just becomes a bland list of facts of who God is rather than a heartfelt relationship. Without thanksgiving, we miss the chance to express gratitude for how God's attributes have intimately touched our own lives. Solomon here, in his prayer, balances this line very well. He acknowledges who God is while simultaneously humbly recognizing what it means for himself. That is a good balance to follow in prayer. Balancing both thanksgiving, how things personally relate to us, but also who God is. And he follows this up with verse 18, which is a recognition of God's transcendence. Verse 18 says, But will God indeed dwell with mankind on the earth? It's a rhetorical question. Will God indeed dwell with mankind on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, how much less this house which I have built. The question that Solomon asks here in verse 18 is one that we need to ask ourselves and reflect on often. And it's important to see here how it fits with the central petition that we're about to get here in the prayer, verses 19 through 21. And that central petition is that God would hear our prayer. Solomon recognizes here in verse 18, he recognizes just how much higher God is than us. But how incredible it is that he still chooses to dwell with his people. Solomon recognizes that God cannot be contained within the walls of the temple. Solomon, again, he reminds himself and he reminds his audience just how much higher God is than us. Which leads us to the central theme of this prayer, verses 19 through 21. Solomon's prayer continues in verses 19 through 21 like this. I actually went ahead and put this one up on the screen because I thought it was that important to focus on. 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 19 through 21 says, "Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, O Yahweh my God, to listen to the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you, that your eye may be open toward this house day and night, toward the place which you have said that you would put your name there, to listen to the prayer which your servant shall pray toward this place. Listen to the supplications of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from your dwelling place. From heaven, God, hear and forgive." The phrases that I highlighted up there are all petitions for God's observance of our prayer. Whether He's seeing us kneeling before Him or He's listening to the words that we're praying, 7 times in just 3 verses, Solomon petitions simply that God would listen, that God would observe his prayer. Which leads us to this question that I don't think we often think about. Do we automatically assume and expect that God will hear us, and by consequence, we take it for granted? Do we approach prayer, whether publicly or privately, so casually that we just automatically assume God will listen to us and expect us that He will respond to us, and we end up taking for granted what it is that we're doing, approaching the throne of the great I Am, of Yahweh, who created everything by His speech. It's important to see here, just in the overall trajectory of the prayer here, that Solomon's only request so far is a listening ear. That's the only thing he's asked from God so far, other than God fulfilling the commitments that He's already made. Solomon's only request from God so far is that He will listen. Now, as we move on to verses 22 through 39, we're not going to read the entirety of this section here. I'm just going to give you the pattern that it follows here. One commentator gave this pattern here. I know that font's a little bit small. I apologize. I had to fit it all on the screen here. But these 7 petitions that follow in verses 22 through 39 follow this pattern of expressing a situation first. It expresses a situation of need, and most of the time in these verses, it involves some sort of sin on behalf of the people. And that's followed with temple-based prayer and confession, meaning that the people, when they would direct their minds toward the temple, toward the dwelling place of God, physically orient themselves to face the temple, that would be helpful to them. And then the third part of it is there's a request. Solomon is praying that God would hear the prayers of the people praying toward this place, toward Jerusalem, where His name would dwell. And then finally, it ends with a section about restoration and forgiveness. That's just kind of the general pattern that these 7 petitions follow here. But the one that I thought was important for us to consider was verses 32 and 33. Verses 32 and 33 say this: Solomon prays also concerning the foreigner who is not from your people Israel, when he comes from a far country, for your great name's sake, and your mighty hand, and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray toward this house, then hear from heaven, from your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you as do your people Israel, that they may know that this house which I have built is called by your name. Solomon here, in this great prayer in front of all of the people, includes a specific petition for the foreigners, for those that were not Israelites. And I think if there's an application that we can make from that, it's that we should be praying for unbelievers, that they would direct themselves toward God's dwelling place, and they would stream in and come to a relationship with Him. The prayer is that those not among God's people would have their prayers answered. Throughout all of this, we see that Solomon maintains his humble attitude and posture. And I think this is important to note because we see that laid from the very beginning, when he first oriented himself toward the temple, and then he blessed the people, and then he raised and spread his hands toward heaven, and he knelt. The attitude that he set at the foundation of his prayer by his posture is being continued throughout the entirety of this prayer here. Solomon concludes the prayer in verses 40 through 42 with a conclusion and a final appeal. If you want to read those with me in verses 40 through 42. This is where Solomon concludes the prayer, and he says, "Now, O my God, I pray, let your eyes be open and your ears be attentive to the prayer offered in this place. Now therefore arise, O Yahweh God, to your resting place. You and the ark of your might, let your priest, O Yahweh God, be clothed with salvation. And let your godly ones rejoice in what is good. O Yahweh, God, do not turn away the face of your anointed. Remember your loving kindness to your servant David." At the very end of his prayer, he echoes that central petition that we saw in verses 19 through 21. He reiterates his petition for God's listening ear. The king, the son of David, the ruler of God's chosen people, is seen constantly begging that God would listen to him. He does not take for granted what he is doing as he approaches the throne of God. And at the very end, at the very, very end of this prayer, in verses 41 through 42, Solomon finally prays for the people. He prays that the priests would be clothed with salvation, that the godly ones would rejoice in what is good. This is the grand conclusion of Solomon's prayer, his dedication of the temple. He prays for the people. So following this, in chapter 7, the first 3 verses, this is where we'll finish tonight. Just offer a few closing comments. After this prayer, in chapter 7, verse 1, when Solomon had finished praying, just picture this scene in these verses here. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of Yahweh filled the house. The priests could not enter into the house of Yahweh because the glory of Yahweh filled Yahweh's house. All the sons of Israel, the whole nation, seeing the fire come down and the glory of Yahweh upon the house, bowed down. They bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and they gave praise to Yahweh, saying, "Truly, He is good. Truly, His loving kindness is everlasting." Following Solomon's prayer, Yahweh approves. He consumes the sacrifice. This picture of God's fire consuming the sacrifice is pictured as approval throughout the Old Testament here. And as God approves the sacrifice, the people's reaction to this scene in front of them is they respond in worship and praise. This is their reaction to the presence of God. The people's response to an acceptable sacrifice is worship and praise. So as we conclude, I want us to look at one final passage and then we'll be done. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 15 and 16. As we consider our own assembling together, what we do, let's look at Hebrews 13, verses 15 and 16. And I think this verse speaks pretty well for itself. The Hebrew writer says, through him then, through Jesus, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God. Where was Solomon in relation to what was going on? It said he was kneeling before the altar. What happens on an altar? Sacrifices. We are to offer up a sacrifice of praise to God that is what? The fruit of our lips that give thanks to His name, and do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Our worship, though we've talked a lot about what we do on Sundays and when we come together in this building, our worship extends beyond these walls. We are called to worship God, to serve Him, to offer up praise throughout all of our life by sharing and helping with others and constantly orienting ourselves towards His presence. Our worship and our life are a sacrifice. And so as we reflect on Solomon's public prayer, we are reminded that our worship today, it still calls for reverent posture. It calls for God-centered prayer, and it calls for a heart expecting God's presence. Solomon knelt, Solomon lifted his hands, and he prayed boldly, not to impress, but to invite God to dwell among His people. And God responded with approving fire. So as we gather together, whether it be today, a week from now, a month from now, let us do the same. Let us approach with awe, lay our worship on the altar, and trust that He still hears and that He responds, because He is good and His steadfast love endures forever. If there's anything you need, prayers or encouragement, I'd encourage you to come forward while we stand and while we